My name is Tabitha, and I am 66 years old. I always believed that by this stage in life I would have peace, a routine of quiet mornings in my garden and evenings with a book. I worked hard for decades, raised my son Orion, and after my husband passed, I poured my energy into the little house we had built together. The house sat on a modest street in Portland, Oregon, lined with maples that turned a fiery red every October. On that morning, the air was cool and crisp, and I was in the garden tending chrysanthemums that were just beginning to bloom. I thought the day would be ordinary, another page in a calm retirement. I was wrong. I heard the crunch of tires on my driveway. The sound was familiar because Orion drove a dark SUV I had helped him buy years ago, but something about the way the door slammed set my nerves on edge. I wiped the dirt from my gloves and stepped around the side of the house. Standing on my porch was Orion, looking worn out and thinner than I remembered, and beside him was his wife Salome, dressed in a designer coat and holding two large suitcases. More luggage rested near the trunk. They were not here for a visit. They were here to move in. I felt my chest tighten before Orion even spoke. He sank into the old porch chair where his father used to sit, shoulders slumped, tie crooked. Salome stood tall beside him, her blonde hair, immaculate eyes sweeping across my front yard like she was already calculating what it was worth. Orion finally spoke and said they had sold their house on Maple Street. My knees nearly gave out. That was the house I had sacrificed $45,000 from my retirement savings to help them buy. I asked why he had not called first. His answer was weak, muttered about how life had changed. Salome's voice cut in calm and cold. She said the house was theirs to sell and that they did not need my permission. I pressed further, asking what they received for the house. Orion avoided my eyes, but Salome smiled like she was sharing good news. $600,000. The number echoed in my head. It was more than I had ever held in my life. My first instinct was relief, because surely they had secured a brighter future. So I asked where they were moving. The silence that followed told me everything. Salome finally explained that the money was gone. She listed her purchases without shame. Jewelry, clothes, a spa trip to California, paying off $80,000 in credit card debt, a car for her mother, $300,000 sunk into a friend's boutique that existed more on paper than in reality. My breath caught. I asked how they could burn through such fortune in mere months. Salome shrugged and said it was her money to spend. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The son I raised, the man who had once promised to take care of me after his father died, sat quietly beside her, defeated. He asked if they could stay with me until they figured things out. My two-bedroom home, barely enough for me, suddenly became their solution. My voice shook when I said no. The word hung heavy in the room, like I had spoken betrayal instead of truth. Orion begged, his eyes filled with shame. Salome's face hardened, then twisted into something cruel. She said I had lived in this small house too long, wearing the same clothes, driving the same car. She accused me of not understanding standards. Her words cut, but I stood firm. I would not let her destruction consume what little peace I had left. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Collins across the street paused her raking. The Johnson boy stopped riding his bicycle. Salome's voice rose, carrying down the block. She shouted that I was heartless, that I was throwing my only son onto the street. I told Orion to leave before it escalated further. Salome stepped closer, her eyes blazing. She raised her hand and struck me across the face. The crack echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a shot. My cheek stung, but the deeper pain was knowing my son watched it happen without moving. For a long moment, everything froze. The neighbors stared. Even Salome seemed startled by what she had done. I felt tears burn, but I steadied my voice and said it was time for her to leave my property. She sneered and dared me to make her. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. As I spoke to the dispatcher describing that I had been assaulted in front of witnesses, I saw fear flicker in Salome's eyes for the first time. When the patrol car arrived, she tried to paint herself as the victim, saying we only needed a place to stay. The officers listened, but Mrs. Collins stepped forward and told them she saw everything. Salome had slapped me unprovoked. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked at Orion, hoping for one final sign of loyalty, but he kept his gaze down. My voice was quiet, but steady when I said yes. Salome was placed in handcuffs and led to the car. Orion gathered the luggage slowly, his face gray and empty. As the patrol car drove away, I stood on my porch with the sting still on my cheek, surrounded by neighbors who had witnessed the unraveling of my family. I felt the weight of betrayal heavier than ever before. My son had allowed his wife to destroy his future and had stood silent as she humiliated me. I knew then that my life had changed forever. This was not only about money, it was about respect boundaries and the painful cost of saying no. I sat at my kitchen table long after the police car left my cheek, still burning, my heart heavier than it had ever been. As the evening shadows crept across the walls, I forced myself to think beyond the sting of betrayal. Years ago, when Orion and Salome bought their house on Maple Street, I had written a check for $45,000. At that time, I thought it was a gift of love, a way to help them begin their life together. But my lawyer, Howard Green, had insisted it be structured as a loan. He told me gently that family and money often led to broken ties, and that a signed promissory note was not a sign of distrust but of wisdom. I remembered Orion saying he wanted it official, promising he would pay me back with interest. Now the house was gone, sold without my consent, and that debt had never been repaid. I opened the file cabinet in my living room and pulled out the folder with Green's neat handwriting on the tab. Inside was the note signed by both Orion and Salome, with repayment terms spelled out clearly. Reading it again felt like a lifeline. It was proof that I was not powerless. My anger began to settle into something sharper, something that carried weight. I had legal ground to stand on, and I would not let their recklessness sweep me under. The next morning I called Green's office. His voice, steady as ever, carried through the receiver. He listened carefully while I explained what had happened, from the slap in front of my neighbors to the confession that the $600,000 was already gone. He reminded me that the promissory note was binding and that selling the property without satisfying the debt was a violation. He told me I could file for repayment and even seek damages. His calm certainty steadied me. He said that sometimes family disputes turned into legal battles, but that standing up for myself did not mean I loved my son any less. It meant I valued the years of work that had built that money. After the call, I looked around my house with new eyes. This was my safe place, the one thing I had fought to keep after my husband passed. I would not let chaos cross my threshold again. I called a locksmith that afternoon. The old brass locks were replaced with stronger ones that clicked with finality when I tested them. I scheduled an installation for a security system with cameras at every entry point. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had taken action instead of waiting for the next blow. It was a shift I could feel deep inside. I was no longer the mother who stood on her porch, humiliated and slapped while neighbors watched. I was the woman who had proof, who had boundaries, who was ready to fight for what was hers. I understood then that love without limits becomes weakness, and weakness was what Salome had counted on. Not anymore. This was the moment where victimhood ended and resolve began. I knew there would be more storms ahead, but I was prepared to face them with steadiness and with the law on my side. Howard Green called me after the investigator finished his work, his tone measured but heavy with truth. The boutique Salome bragged about did not exist. No license, no storefront, nothing but a lie to swallow $300,000. My heart sank as I realized that money had never been meant for a future with Orion. The investigator dug further and found a trail of past deceit. Salome had been engaged twice before, each time leaving men with credit card bills totaling more than $50,000. Court records showed a pattern of manipulation using affection as bait and money as prey. It was not an accident or a single mistake. It was who she had chosen to be. Then came the final blow. Receipts and hotel records tied her to Richard Coleman, a married contractor in his 50s. Jewelry, spa trips, and private dinners were all funded by Orion's sacrifice. The affair explained her sudden urgency, her reckless spending, and her fury when I said no. Orion, my son, still believed she was his partner, not realizing she had built an entire life in secret. I sat with the file in my hands, the papers shaking, though my voice grew steady. The betrayal cut deeper than I imagined, but the clarity it brought was undeniable. This was no longer just a family conflict. It was a battle for survival against a woman who had perfected destruction. I would not let her win. The Denver County courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. I sat behind my attorney, Howard Green, my hands folded in my lap while my heart beat against my ribs. Across the aisle sat Salome in a navy dress and pearls, her hair smoothed into a perfect wave. She looked every inch the picture of composure, as if she were the victim of some cruel misunderstanding. Her attorney, a sharp woman with quick eyes, painted me as a bitter mother-in-law, determined to destroy a young marriage out of jealousy and spite. She spoke of family disagreements, mistakes made in youth, and my supposed obsession with control. Each word made my stomach twist, but I held still. I had heard enough lies from Salome to recognize another performance. When it was Howard's turn, his voice carried calm authority. He laid the promissory note on the judge's bench and explained how the loan was documented, signed by both Orion and Salome, with clear repayment terms. He called Mrs. Collins my neighbor, who testified she saw Salome strike me across the face without provocation. Then he introduced records, thick stacks of receipts showing $600,000 gone in months. Jewelry, spa trips, vacations, credit card debts, a boutique investment with no business license. The courtroom grew hushed as the evidence piled higher, the illusion of innocence unraveling. Salome kept her eyes down, dabbing her face with the tissue. Her lawyer tried to shift the focus, insisting it was just reckless spending, not fraud. She said young women make mistakes, and that I was punishing Salome for not living up to my standards. Howard waited until she finished, then asked for his next witness. The bailiff opened the side door and Richard Coleman entered, tall and gray, his face pale. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Under oath, Richard admitted what the investigator had found. He confessed he had been involved with Salome for months, paying for her lifestyle, while believing she was separated from her husband. He revealed how she lied about being abused and abandoned, how she used Orion's money to maintain their affair. The weight of his words silenced even Salome's attorney. I watched Salome's face drain of color as Richard described the dinners, the hotels, and the gifts. The facade she had built cracked wide open under the fluorescent lights. The judge looked sternly at Salome, but before the gavel could fall, Orion stood. His voice shook at first, but then steadied. He told the court that in the early years of his marriage, he had falsified some documents to qualify for a loan. It was wrong, he admitted, but he had already confessed it to the authorities. He had voluntarily disclosed everything, paying penalties, making sure it could no longer be used against him. Salome's head had snapped toward him, eyes blazing. I realized in that moment that Orion had stripped her of her last weapon. She could no longer threaten him with secrets he had kept hidden. The judge's ruling came with deliberate clarity. She said the evidence showed a clear case of fraud, manipulation, and assault. She ordered repayment of $68,000, including interest and damages, and warned that failure to comply would result in wage garnishment and asset seizure. She also announced she was forwarding the case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. Salome's sobbing filled the courtroom, but the judge's expression did not waver. I sat in silence, a mixture of relief and grief washing through me. Justice had been served, but the price was the shattering of what little remained of my family. Orion looked at me, his eyes hollow, but clearer than I had seen in years. The truth had cut through the lies, and though the wounds would take time to heal for the first time, I felt that we were no longer trapped in Salome's web. Orion moved out of the motel and into a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Denver. The walls were bare and the furniture second-hand, but it was his. For the first time in years, he knew exactly what he owed and exactly what he owned. He worked late shifts and weekends, putting in the extra hours to slowly pay back what he had promised me. His voice over the phone carried exhaustion, but there was something else, too. He said it felt like breathing free, like chains had been lifted. I listened to him describe cooking his own meals and budgeting every dollar. He sounded lighter, as if the constant pressure of Salome's demands had finally lifted from his shoulders. I told him how proud I was that he had chosen accountability over excuses. He promised he would make every payment not just to repay the debt, but to prove he was the man I had raised. Each month when the check arrived, I felt not only the relief of financial recovery, but the deeper relief of knowing my son was reclaiming himself. Meanwhile, I made my own fresh start. I sold the house in Portland and moved to a retirement community in Arizona. The air was dry and warm, the mountains painted the horizon each evening, and my new garden began to bloom under the desert sun. I joined a book club, a garden circle, and even a walking group that met at 7 o'clock each morning. Each day felt like a chance to build something peaceful, far from the turmoil of the past. For both of us, setting boundaries had opened the door to new beginnings. Healing came not in grand gestures, but in the quiet dignity of choosing a different path. A year passed before I saw anyone connected to Salome again. One afternoon, as I was watering the roses in my Arizona garden, a young woman approached the gate. She introduced herself as Julia Salome's younger sister. Her eyes carried the same pale blue, but there was none of the hardness I remembered. She told me she needed me to understand something about Salome's past. Their mother had forced them to believe survival depended on marrying into money. Salome was pushed toward wealthy men as a way to pay off old family debts, and the pressure had shaped her into someone obsessed with wealth and status. I listened in silence as Julia spoke. She admitted that none of this excused what Salome had done to me or to Orion, but she hoped I would see the brokenness beneath the cruelty. The story explained many things, though it did not undo the hurt. I felt an unexpected wave of sadness. For all her venom, Salome had been carrying wounds that twisted into something destructive. I knew I could never forget the pain she caused, but in that moment, I chose to release the hatred I had been holding. Later that evening, I sat in my garden, the Arizona sunset painting the sky in soft gold. The roses I had planted bloomed stronger in the desert soil than I imagined they could. As I pruned the blossoms, I whispered to myself that mercy does not erase consequences. It simply frees the heart so healing can take root.